6 months ago, 4 teenagers, Sarah, James, Alex, and Emma, set out on what was meant to be a fun weekend hiking trip in the dense wilderness of Mount Carver, a rugged and mysterious location far from their small town. Known for its foggy mornings, untamed wildlife, and a history of strange disappearances, Mount Carver was both feared and revered. However, the group saw it as the perfect adventure, a way to escape the pressures of high school and experience the wild before the summer ended. They arrived at the base of the mountain early in the evening. The sky was a dull orange as the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest that lay ahead. They were excited, their backpacks heavy with supplies, and their laughter echoed through the empty spaces of the parking lot. They could hear the faint sounds of a nearby stream, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. The hike was supposed to be a 2-day adventure, and they were eager to dive into the experience. As they set up camp near a small stream that ran through the base of the forest, the mood was light. The fire crackled as they cooked their first meal, the heat from the flames casting dancing shadows across their faces. They made jokes and told stories, taking in the beauty of the untouched wilderness. But as the night deepened, the forest seemed to take on an unsettling quality, like it was watching them. Sarah, the most grounded of the group, felt a sense of unease but pushed it aside. "It's just the dark," she told herself, trying to shake the creeping sensation that something was off. Yet, despite her best efforts to ignore it, she couldn't help but notice how the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, the way the shadows seemed to move just a little too much, as though alive. The group fell asleep without incident, the sounds of the forest filling their tents. But in the early hours of the morning, Sarah awoke to an odd feeling, a sensation that she wasn't alone. She opened her eyes to the faintest glow from the moon peeking through the trees, but she didn't dare get up to check. Instead, she forced herself back to sleep. By morning, the strange sense of unease had only deepened. The group packed up their things and set off for a hike into the heart of the forest. They followed a narrow trail, their boots crunching on the fallen leaves, their laughter filling the air. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change, becoming darker, quieter. The birds had stopped singing, and the only sounds were the crunch of their feet and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Around midday, they came across something unusual. A circle of ancient, gnarled trees, their trunks twisted in unnatural shapes, creating a perfect ring. At the center of the circle lay a massive stone, covered in moss and covered in strange carvings that seemed to glow faintly. Emma, always the curious one, was the first to step forward, her fingers brushing against the markings. "Look at this," she said, excitement in her voice. "This must be really old." James, ever the explorer, leaned in closer, trying to decipher the symbols. But before anyone could make a comment, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees. The temperature dropped sharply, and Emma shivered, pulling her hand back from the stone. "Maybe we should go," Sarah said, her voice laced with worry. "This place doesn't feel right." But James, undeterred, was determined to investigate further. "We're already here. Let's at least see where this leads." The group hesitated, but Alex, though quiet, agreed with James, and so they pushed deeper into the forest, following a trail that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The path became thinner and more treacherous, the trees closing in around them, blocking the sunlight. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, pushing them farther into its depths. As the afternoon turned into evening, the tension began to rise. The atmosphere grew heavier with every step, and they began to notice the strange markings on the trees, scratches, symbols, and carvings that none of them recognized. They could hear the rustling of leaves behind them, but when they turned to look, no one was there. It was as if something or someone was following them. A chill swept through the group. At that point, something strange happened. James, who had been leading the way, suddenly stopped. His face went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Before anyone could respond, James turned and darted off in the direction of the sound. "James, wait!" Alex called, but his voice was drowned out by the heavy silence that followed. Without thinking, Alex and the others rushed after him, calling his name, but the forest had swallowed him up. Minutes turned into hours as they searched in vain for their friend. The forest seemed endless, the trees forming a labyrinth they couldn't escape. The sky began to darken, and the once familiar surroundings now seemed alien, unfamiliar. The path they had walked on earlier had vanished, replaced by dense undergrowth and twisted branches. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. By nightfall, they were no closer to finding James. They were cold, hungry, and disoriented. Sarah and Emma insisted they return to camp, but when they tried, the forest had transformed. The trees that once marked their path seemed different, twisted in new ways, obscuring any trace of the way back. It was as if the forest itself was mocking them. At some point, they lost track of time. Their supplies were running low, and their bodies ached from exhaustion. Fear began to settle in, a gnawing sense of hopelessness creeping into their hearts. But just as they were about to collapse from fatigue, something caught their attention. Through the trees, they saw a faint light, an eerie glow coming from the distance. They rushed toward it, hoping for some sign of safety, only to find an ancient stone temple hidden deep within the forest. Covered in moss and vines, it looked as if it had been untouched for centuries. The entrance was dark, like a black mouth waiting to swallow them whole. They stepped inside cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the stone hall. Inside, strange carvings adorned the walls, symbols they didn't recognize, but ones that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. It was there, in the dim light of the temple, that they saw her. An old woman, her face hidden behind a veil of tangled hair, stood in the shadows. She wore tattered, ancient clothing that seemed to blend with the darkness around her. When she spoke, it was in a language none of them understood, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down their spines. She beckoned them toward her, motioning to the doorway behind her. Without thinking, they moved forward, drawn by some unseen force. But before they could leave the temple, Alex caught sight of something. Beneath the stone floor, a faint glow pulsed, and as he stepped closer, the earth beneath them trembled. The ground shifted, and suddenly, everything went black. Alex awoke alone in the forest, disoriented and broken. His head was pounding, and his limbs were heavy with fatigue. He had no memory of how he had ended up on the forest floor, and worse, he had no memory of what had happened to Sarah, Emma, or James. He was alone. He stumbled through the forest, his body weak, searching for a way out. Days turned into weeks as he wandered aimlessly, surviving on what little he could find. The woods seemed endless, and the more he searched, the more disoriented he became. It was as if the forest itself had changed him, made him forget the way back. One day, after what felt like an eternity, Alex came across a small, decaying cabin deep in the woods. The door was ajar, and a faint smell of food wafted from inside. Desperate, he entered, finding an old man sitting by the fire. The man was kind enough to offer him food, but his eyes were strange, dark, knowing. As Alex ate, the man spoke of the forest, of its ancient power and the curse that held it in thrall. He spoke of people who had vanished over the years and how the forest claimed them. Alex, too frightened to ask about his friends, listened in silence. But when he finally stood to leave, the old man warned him, "The forest has already claimed you. There is no leaving." Despite the warning, Alex stepped out of the cabin, his heart pounding. The forest stretched out before him, its trees tall and imposing. As he looked back toward the cabin, it had vanished, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. 6 months later, Alex was found on the edge of the forest. His body was weak, his clothes torn, and his mind shattered. He had no memory of what had happened to his friends, only a faint sense of loss and fear. The forest had changed him, and no matter how much he tried, he could never escape its grip. The search for Sarah, James, and Emma continued, but no trace of them was ever found. The wilderness remained silent, its secrets held close by the trees, waiting for the next wanderer to lose their way. And Alex? He was never the same again. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. The mystery of their disappearance would never be solved, and the forest's dark power would continue to lure others into its depths, where they, too, would vanish.